What inspired you to write the books?
I would say that I've been inspired by a number of different factors to write the two novels. I always knew that I wanted to write. I knew that I would want to write about a girl protagonist who would be bright and articulate and knowledgeable about her surroundings, the people around her. And this is what led to Aunt Jen. But Aunt Jen was also the result of something I had carried in my head for a long time. I knew about the Jamaican migration to the UK, and I had an idea of how some children had been adversely affected in the ways that Sunshine, our protagonist, seems to be affected. I also wanted to write about community. The village life in Jamaica had a great impact on my life as a girl who grew up in rural Jamaica and who saw a different kind of life from perhaps what rural life has become now, but a different kind of life from the life I saw in the city when I went to live in the city. So rural life for me was a place of great contentment and happiness, a place of beauty, a place of peace where people shared and people counseled children, and children were respectful and saw adults as their advisors and counselors and protectors. This is the rural Jamaica that I grew up with and always wanted to share in a work. Some of my poems carry this kind of rural Jamaica. So I wanted to write about rural Jamaica. I wanted to write about the grandmother. So Ma had to be in that novel because the grandmother, I had very special grandmothers and they played very important roles in my life, and I wanted to have them in a book one day. I also wanted to share, when I got to this point at which I was now writing Letters Home, I wanted to talk about some of the stories that have been neglected in the Windrush experience, in the migration to the UK story. There's a dominant story about the Windrush people, that they came, they were treated badly, and so on. Yes, there is that story, but I do not think that enough has been said about their role in nation building, in how they came after the World War, or went after the World War to the UK and made their contributions to the development of powerful Britain. These were people who came from all over the Caribbean, and they played critical roles in rebuilding England, which is the reason they were called. But the stories that have not been told are of those people who are not Windrush people, and there are those who want to make that distinction, that we did not come on Windrush. We came on ships like the SS Irpinia, and nobody talks about those ships. So there are different dimensions to migration that get told in Letters Home, for instance, that I wanted to include. There are stories of some of the children who came from little Jamaica to Britain and didn't want to stay. Their parents had to send them back home to their grandparents. So there are all kinds of secondary stories that I thought needed to be told, and was told in Letters Home.
Why did people come to Britain?
So I touched on some of the reasons people came to Britain. They came mainly because when at the in the incipient stages we were still a colony. So when they were called to come and help to rebuild England after the Second World War, we were still a colony, so they could simply get their colonial passports and come, and it wasn't a problem in terms of their status as non-natural citizens of Britain. Jamaica became independent in 1962. Many of the Caribbean countries became independent round about that time or later on and lost that status. But they came because many of them were sent by their parents who had been brought up as proper colonial subjects and felt that the motherland needs you. Come and build Britain. And they came. Some came to seek their fortune. They thought this was the way to improve their lot, improve their lives. And they came. They met with many hardships. They were strong people. They were very determined to succeed. Some of them stayed and went back home after a short time. My own father was one person who was there for 3 years and came back to Jamaica, where he was very successful and wouldn't have had it any other way. There were some who came to Britain, returned to their respective countries, were not happy and went back. There was also an earlier period when West Indians went to Britain. There were many people who went to fight in the war. They went to be RAF soldiers. Many of them, well, not many of them, all of them, they knew nothing about wars, but they were called as subjects and they rose to the occasion and went. Some became pilots flying over bombs and war zones. They were soldiers on the front line. Now, many of them returned to their countries after the war, were not happy, and once they were called to go back to work, they went. So there was a period of movement to Britain by West Indian persons.
Considering the hardships they faced, why did they not return to Jamaica? What made them stay?
I think many of them stayed because after being in Britain for a number of years, they had established so many connections. They had made families, they had children. They did not want to uproot themselves and go back. Some of them had lost their families. Many of them will tell you that when they were going, their parents were alive. By the time they had been in Britain for 5-6 years, their parents had died. Their siblings they had lost contact with their siblings, and so it made it difficult for them to return. Some of them just did not want to go back. Many of them actually liked being in this different space and wanted to remain. My own mother was one of these persons who came to Britain as a very young woman and claims that she grew up in Britain and she preferred to be there. So there were many reasons why many of them stayed.
What other options apart from coming to the UK did people have?
Some people saw themselves as having no options, and so the opportunity that was presented was a welcome one. They embraced it as a way of improving situations for themselves and their families back home. Some of them had the chance to enter into professions such as nursing that they probably would never have done if they had remained in Jamaica, because perhaps it was a little more difficult for many of them to do that. I think Britain made it easier for them mainly because again there was such a need for nurses and for people to work in different professions after the war. Many of them would have remained at home and become farmers, people working on the family land, or working for different people who had land, a lot of land. They would have worked for them, but there perhaps would have been significant challenges for some of them had they remained. Before the migration to England, many of them had gone to Panama. Many West Indian men had gone to work in Panama, to work on the railway line in Panama, to build the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal was built largely through the sweat and blood of Jamaican men in the main, Barbadian men, Kititians, Vincentians, and so on. And they turned to them because they had had experience building the railway line in Jamaica. The railway line in Jamaica was the second railway line to be built outside of the UK. Canada was first, then Jamaica. So these Jamaican men had experience gained from working with British engineers in blasting rocks, in soldering metal, and so they became very useful to the different companies that were going through the Central American region to begin with, establishing banana plantations and citrus farms and so on. And when they needed to penetrate the interiors of those rugged terrains, they needed people who could lay railway lines, withstand the harsh weather, harsh climate. They had used other people. They had used the Chinese, for instance, and they could not withstand the conditions. And the word went out that there were Jamaican men who were strong and trained by English engineers. So they had gone. The Jamaicans had been exposed to this idea of going abroad to work. And they had gone to Panama, they went to Costa Rica, they went to Ecuador, they went to Cuba. And so this idea of migration was not new to them. And migration has become such a central feature of Caribbean life. Caribbean people are always moving out. When we come to Letters Home creates a sense of this network of movement that Caribbean people became involved in moving out to seek their fortune, so to speak, and in creating different diasporas, and taking the culture, the Jamaican culture, the Caribbean culture, to different parts of the world.
If the Windrush generation could do it all again, would they?
I think that if the Windrush generation could do it all over, they would do it. I have spoken to many of these older people, and it's amazing how these people could have left their homes, left their families, and gone to work in this foreign place, a place that was cold and a place in which they experienced racism and all kinds of challenges. And they made a life for themselves. They did not necessarily become wealthy, but they, as far as they were concerned, they had better living conditions for the most part. Some of them will tell you that they had, I have heard some of them say that when they got to England, they realized that their living conditions were not so bad, because things were so bad in England at the time, where, you know, things, so much had been destroyed in the war. So they, in comparison, but as time went on and they saw how in an industrialized or country moving faster and faster towards industrialization, things could improve at a faster rate than in a more agrarian society. We're so much dependent on the land and agriculture and so on. So they would do it again for the experience. Just like the ones who went to Panama and Costa Rica, they would do it again. But they never forgot home. That is the one defining characteristic of all of them with whom I have talked. The third, fourth generations in Costa Rica, in Panama, in England, in Cuba, they have never forgotten their Caribbean roots.